So we are now recording. Welcome, folks. Thanks for joining us this evening. My name is Ian Burns. I work with the Merrimack Valley Planning Commission. I'll introduce a little bit about our organization in just a minute. But we are here tonight joined by the town of North Andover, who was very gracious in welcoming us to come and help you all learn a little bit about the MBTA communities legislation this evening. Before I hop into talking a little bit about MVPC and what we're doing here, I just wanted to hand it over to the town staff, get a chance to introduce themselves. So Andrew or Jean, you want to say hello?
Sure.
Go ahead.
Jean, go ahead.
Hi, this is Jean Enright. I'm the planning director for the town.
And I'm Andrew Shapiro. I'm an assistant town manager and director of community and economic development. Thanks all for being here tonight.
Thank you both. And I'm joined by Kayla Rennie, who is also on our staff here at MVPC. So we have a little bit of a presentation and we want it to be an interactive meeting tonight. So we're definitely going to pause for questions and feedback throughout the presentation today. So hopefully there'll be a lot of learning and questions and comments as we go along. I'm going to go right ahead and our agenda for this evening. So we're going to start talking a little bit about some background on the MBTA communities and law and the state regulations that come out of that. After we work our way through the state regulations, we're going to open up for some questions and clarifications on what the regulations are specifically, give folks a chance to learn and ask anything clarifying that they may be confused about. After we talk about the state law and the regulations that go along with it, we're then going to dive into the process that has been unfolding in North Andover over the past year and what that process has narrowed down for potential zoning districts that will be voted on at town meeting this year in May. After we talk a little bit about the districts and process in North Andover, we're going to pause again for some questions and feedback to hear any comments that the public has about our plans so far, or the town's plans for potential zoning districts. And then we'll talk a little bit about what the next steps are going to be and how this whole process is going to unfold in town over the next few months leading up to town meeting. Before I dive into the regulations, just wanted to say who we are at the Merrimack Valley Planning Commission. So we're a public agency. We support the 15 cities and towns of the Merrimack Valley region. That's essentially everywhere from Lawrence to the coast of Newburyport as far as our territory. So we assist our cities and towns with everything from zoning, housing development, comprehensive planning, geographic information systems, technology, transportation planning, environmental planning, and more. So we are often contracted by the town or work with the town on various planning efforts to help bring a regional approach and a local specific approach to certain planning efforts. In the context of the MBTA communities legislation, the town received grant funds to hire a consultant, which is us, to help the town understand the regulations and learn options for compliance. The Planning Commission, although we are a quasi-state agency, we did not write the law or the regulations. We are here to help explain what those regulations are and find some options for the town to reach compliance. We do talk with the state regularly. However, we have no input in the actual law or regulations required. As I mentioned, I'm Ian Burns. I oversee our community and economic development department here at MVPC. I'm joined by Kayla Rennie, who is in our department, and then we have one other member, Lauren, who taps in on this and other processes throughout the region. I will mention MVPC is not only doing this work in North Andover, but we're helping several other communities in the Merrimack Valley region reach compliance with the MBTA Communities Act. So with that in mind, I'm going to hop right into some background on MBTA communities and what exactly this means here and what this new state law is. So this law was passed by the Massachusetts legislature just a couple of years ago, and it applies to all, applies to all cities and towns that have MBTA transit stops or are bordering a town with a transit stop. So since North Andover borders communities with a commuter rail stop, it is subject to this law. The goal of the legislation was to open up additional zoning opportunities to allow more housing to potentially be built and address the housing shortage we find ourselves in, resulting in higher prices for rents and ownerships across the state. This law requires communities to have a zoning district that allows multifamily housing by right. So really key here is that this only requires the creation of the zoning district. You might hear us talking about unit capacity numbers and density and such later on. However, everything here only relates to zoning. We are not required to build anything as a part of this law. And when we talk about potential zoning districts, it does not matter what has been built or what will be built in the future, because all that the state cares about is that we have zoning that is compliant with the law. It is okay if nothing is constructed as a result of the zoning change that the town is, or that the state is asking us to implement. So given that, I'm just freezing before I can navigate my PowerPoint. I will toggle to the next, there we go. So the legislation specifically, what exactly do we have to zone for here in town, and what is it saying for most communities across the state? So number one, we have to be allowing for multifamily housing as of right in these zoning districts. Multifamily housing is defined as a structure with 3 or more dwelling units, housing units within that structure. As a part of this zoning bylaw, we cannot put any age restrictions on it, and we also cannot put restrictions on the number of bedrooms that are allowed in the zoning district. The zoning must be able to theoretically accommodate a minimum of 15 units per acre. And the reason we use that phrasing, theoretically accommodate 15 units per acre, is because we know that pretty often we'll create zoning parameters that might allow, in a perfect world, for 15 units per acre to be built. But in reality, we do not actually need to build 15 units per acre. We may zone a district and think that it's possible to do it, but a developer could very easily come in and build less density than that, and that is fully acceptable under the law. For communities with a transit stop, which is not North Andover, they have to prioritize land area within a half mile of their commuter rail station or a transit station for their district. So they have to have a portion of it next to the commuter rail stop itself. North Andover, this is not applicable. North Andover has much more flexibility with where we can locate the zoning district. So here's just a quick snapshot of the Merrimack Valley region so that folks can become aware of exactly what is happening across the state and the region. It's not just North Andover that is subject to this law. All of your neighboring communities in Massachusetts are also subject to this law. This map is color-coded by different community types. So the legislation and the subsequent regulations have essentially split up communities into different categories, and those categories carry different types of regulations and requirements for the communities subject to those categories. North Andover here, as you might be able to see, is kind of that darker yellow color. That's for adjacent communities, so communities that are right next to another city or town that has a commuter rail stop. That darker teal color refers to communities that have a commuter rail stop, and then the lighter yellow are a special designation for rural and small towns that border communities with a transit stop. So North Andover is kind of right in the middle as far as those regulations go. There's a separate category for rapid transit communities. Those are communities with regular T service, like the orange, red line, and green line. None of that is applicable up here in this region. So what does this mean for North Andover being in that kind of darker yellow category of an adjacent community? So we have to create a zoning district that is a minimum of 50 acres. Like we said before, the zoning has to allow for theoretically up to a minimum of 15 units per acre. In North Andover, that zoning district has to have a capacity equal to about 10% of your existing housing stock in town. And we should have some reasonable access to a transit station, whether that's through bus, pedestrian use, or other easy transportation options to get to public transit. With all of that in mind, North Andover is required to create a zoning district that could theoretically accommodate about 1,200 units. So again, going back to that idea that we do not actually have to build these units, all that is required of the town is to create zoning that has the potential to allow that many units. Again, that is under perfect conditions. It is very common for developers to come in and not be able to fully build out a site. We just have to prove to the state that it is possible under the zoning parameters for a theoretical development to happen at that size. A couple more slides, and then we're going to pause for questions that folks may have. So just to give context and what this looks like across the Merrimack Valley, you'll see North Andover there is highlighted in red at that close to 1,200 unit requirement. But then you'll see the other communities that actually have a commuter rail stop have a much higher threshold to reach. Andover, for example, is a little bit less than double at over 2,000 units required. Our bigger cities, Haverhill and Lawrence, over 4,000. But then our rural and small towns are all the way on the lower end at around 100 units or 150 units. So North Andover is kind of in a sweet spot right in the middle in terms of as far as requirements go, where it's not on the high end, not on the low end, trying to fit right in the middle for state requirements. We were talking a lot about 15 units per acre because that is written in the legislation. So before we kind of move on from the idea of what the regulations are, we wanted to give some context for that because a lot of times it's very hard to visualize what exactly does it mean when we say 15 units per acre. So we have a couple of slides of examples of what already exists in town that meets that 15 units per acre requirement. This first slide here is an example of some small scale developments. And you might look at these and say there's not 15 units there, so how is it 15 units per acre? What we're really looking at is just the density on the parcel that these buildings sit. So that first example there, 127 Marblehead Street, it is only 4 units, but it's 4 units on 1/10 of an acre. So that actually calculates out to 40 units an acre because you're only on 1/10 of an acre of land. So that's what we mean when we say the density needs to be at 15 units per acre, even if you're not filling out a whole acre. On the right, that development there, that structure there is roughly 38 units per acre. Sounds like a really, really high density. When they're on these smaller parcels here, you can tell that they are also smaller developments and that it's not as intrusive as others might seem. And then some medium scale development examples. These are two, the one on the left on Sutton Street in town, that sits at about 29 units per acre. Again, just because it might be on more of a medium sized parcel. And then on the right, that's a recent development that has been proposed in town and it has worked its way through the planning board process on Main Street. And that would model out to about 38 units per acre. So again, just showing you that there are some pretty high density examples in town. And then the final example we have here, some larger scale development examples, Avalon Bay and Princeton Properties. You may be familiar with these. They're newer developments in North Andover. Avalon over in the High Street area at 18 units an acre and Princeton Properties at 21 units an acre. So one of the key takeaways here that we like to draw attention to is that all of these developments that we've shown are above the state minimum requirements of 15 units per acre. And so just drawing some comparatives to what already exists in the community to see that pretty often some of these developments end up higher than 15 units per acre. So 15 units may be doable in a community where you've seen developments happen in the past at that density. Andrew and Jean, interrupt me as I go through if you have anything else to add as I'm flying through these slides here. So just wanted to give a couple examples. We've talked a lot about the requirements and what the state is requiring of the town, and you might be wondering, so what exactly can we control? What does the town get to decide? So a couple of things. After putting out all of those parameters of density and unit capacity requirements, the state has also said that really the bulk of the zoning is up to the community as long as you can meet those minimums. So things that we've been considering over the past year are things like the location of the districts. Where does it make sense to zone for multifamily housing in North Andover? We also have flexibility in deciding the actual zoning parameters. What are the setbacks? What are the height requirements? What are the parking requirements? And more different factors that we want to consider when putting in development. We also can require some affordability in the future development. North Andover has an inclusionary zoning bylaw, and we're looking to implement that as a part of this zoning district. The town also still has control over plan review. So that's when a developer has to go in front of the planning board and show their development plans and how they are adhering to the town's needs. Plan review covers a whole host of things like stormwater management, traffic circulation and generation, utility capacity, emergency access, design standards, making sure they look nice, and more. So there is still a good amount of control at the planning board level if a development were to happen. And then finally, we've received a lot of questions recently about environmental protections, and we just want to highlight that although these are by right developments that may happen, all developments still have to comply with relevant environmental protections like the Wetlands Protection Act. So if a developer is coming in, they still have to make sure they're complying with state and local laws as it relates to your environmental protections. With all that in mind, what exactly is the timeline we're looking at here? You can see on the left side of this timeline, this has all been in process, at least on the state level, since 2021. And then in North Andover, we really got underway about a year ago to plan out some potential zoning districts. North Andover, per the state guidelines, has until the end of this calendar year to adopt a compliant zoning amendment. What that means is that we have to pass it at town meeting. So we're aiming for the May 2024 town meeting, the usual annual town meeting, to pass this compliant bylaw. So over the next few months, you're going to see a lot more about this, especially as the planning board starts their public hearings shortly. Finally, one of the big questions is, well, what happens if we vote this down at town meeting and the town does not comply with the law? So a couple of things to keep in mind that have been made very clear by the state throughout this process. Number one is, quite frankly, this is a state law. It is a law, and the Attorney General has made clear that they intend to enforce the law for communities that do not comply. What we'd like to talk about is right now the town has a lot of control over how it can implement this statute and its regulations, and we want to take advantage of that control that you have right now. And in the future, if towns are not compliant, the Attorney General has threatened legal action against communities that do not approve a local bylaw. The next thing that was written in the law is that if you are not compliant, you will immediately lose access to a group of state grant programs, and then you'll also be less competitive when applying for about a dozen other state grant programs. And when looking at North Andover over the past few years, North Andover has accessed over $6 million in funding from these grant programs. So this is a pretty significant amount of funds that North Andover has been able to tap into on the state level and risk losing access to that funding in the future. If the town can't access grant funds, then the only other source for it to access funding for this is through the regular taxpayers and through different leverage options. So you're not going to want it to fall to tax rolls in town for some of the work the town has done under those grant programs. Finally, the determinations of compliance, if the town is compliant, that may inform other funding decisions by other state agencies. So we've outlined there's about 12 state grant programs. However, the state has also said there may be others down the line that consider your compliance with this law when we decide to award funds. So there's a lot to be thinking about, and there's a lot of warnings out there, and we want to make sure that the town has the most information it can when making a decision and when residents are making a decision at town meeting as to whether or not they vote in favor of this zoning district. So that was a lot of information that we just flew through in some of those slides there. Andrew and Jean, feel free to chime in if I missed anything there or you want to emphasize a few of the points. But I do want to open it up now if folks, any members of the public that are attending have questions or want some clarifications on what we just went over before we dive into the North Andover specific districts. We'd be more than happy to hear your comments and answer them. Feel free, it's a small enough group. You can unmute and speak up and we'll address the questions as they come in.
Hi, I'm Susie. I just was wondering, you said that the planning board would still look at contractors and submitting their plans. I always thought that you only have to go in front of the planning board if something is not zoned to the specifications that you plan to build.
That's a great question. Jean, do you want to comment on that process a little bit?
Sure. I think you're referring to a zoning board process. And so if they're not compliant with the zoning bylaw, they need to have relief granted by our zoning board of appeals. That oftentimes is concurrent with the planning board application, but the planning board is more about development opportunities. And so when a developer is going to build a commercial project that's greater than 2,000 square feet of gross floor area, there's a review before the planning board. This review we're proposing is called a plan review. And the bylaw, if you haven't seen it yet, will certainly, through this presentation, show you where you can review that draft bylaw. But that bylaw will have very specific information required when it comes time. And it is very, very similar to what is considered site plan review before our planning board today. And so it's same type of information, same parameters, all lined out in the zoning bylaw amendment that's going to be proposed.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you. Great question. I think we might have had, just checking to see if we have any questions in the chat.
We do, and I don't mind giving my quick
go ahead.
response on the
Just bring it
question.
up.
So Stan
Yeah.
Novak's asking, where are our state reps on this? They should represent the people, not the state. So I think as Ian mentioned earlier in the presentation, and I want to emphasize it as well, this is a state law. This isn't North Andover's idea. We're just in the process now where we have to either decide to comply or not comply with it. We're putting forth a plan to comply with it that we think it can be reasonably adopted by the town. I think something to keep in mind is this was passed back in 2021, so it was under the previous administration. The Charlie Baker administration passed this, but of course the Healy administration is now in the process of enforcing it. And I don't have the voting roles, but it had to go through a legislative process. So the state legislature, state reps, and the state senate had to vote on the legislation, and then it ultimately went to the governor's desk for signature. I don't know where our particular state reps where they fell on it. I can't, because I don't have it in front of me. Reps Nguyen or at the time Rep Minicucci and Senator Tarr. But again, this was a process where all the state representatives voted this up or down. Ultimately, it got voted through, and it was signed by the previous administration. So that's where they are on it. And I think they probably have, through the process, and Ian, you can correct me if I'm wrong on this, they may have played some process on how the regulations have come out. I think something also to keep in mind is, prior to, we used to have a larger requirement under the amount of units that we had to create. But we worked with the state on clarifying our particular situation. I think a lot of towns and cities around the Commonwealth did the same thing. And so we had our designation changed, and we had a reduction in our required unit capacity. So now it's, I forget how much we were required to build or required to zone for before, but now we're required to zone for 1191, and that's a reduction from where we were when this process started.
I think it was roughly 1,700 originally.
Thanks, Jim.
And Ian, if I could, I'd like to just follow up on my response earlier.
Mm-hmm.
So when I referred to plan review, Susie, the difference between site plan review and plan review is not subject to what's called a special permit. Site plan review in our bylaw is by special permit. And the reason for that is that by right term or as of right term that's been used tonight, by right or as of right requirement means you can't require a special permit. But again, all the information and process they're very, very similar.
Thank you. Good questions. Any other questions on the regulations and what's required of the town at this time before we talk a little bit about the districts that are being considered? Alrighty, we will.
Ian,
yeah.
there's a good question that Stan just.
Go ahead.
raised.
Oh, I see it.
The last one there, and all the other, whether or not the units that have been built recently, whether they could count toward, that's probably a question you can address, Ian, if you don't mind.
Yeah, happily. So because this legislation only refers to zoning, we actually don't consider anything that's been built or will be built. So all the state cares about is if the underlying zoning allows multifamily by right. So if there's a zoning district that allows multifamily housing, that's all that matters. What does not matter is what is currently under construction or has been constructed. And to that vein too, the state does not care if you zone a district and nothing eventually gets built. So we could zone this in an area that never sees development happen, and that is totally acceptable. And I think, as you'll see in a minute with some of the districts, there isn't there is a small chance in some of the areas that we may not see development next year and may not even see it in 10 years. But all that matters is that the underlying zoning allows for that that building. Good question. All right, I'm going to navigate to the next slide, and at any time too, as we make our way through this, if there are other clarifications on the regulations, feel free to ask. It's a complicated topic, and we want to make sure that we take the time to help everybody understand what exactly it is we're discussing, especially as you'll have to be voting on it in the future at town meeting. So just to give you an idea of what we've been going through in North Andover up until this point, we're not going to go through all of these bullets specifically, but we wanted just to give you some highlights of the public engagement to date. So there's been a whole host of public meetings on this topic starting back in 2022. So as I mentioned, the bulk of the work has been over the past year, over 2023 and into 2024. But conversations have been ongoing, and a lot of those conversations have been at public meetings of the planning board or select board. We also had 3 public specific meetings where we had them for the general public and not at a board or commission to receive feedback and thoughts on these different initiatives. So that was over this past fall and into the winter. And then we had an in-person meeting on this issue back in the fall. And here we are doing a virtual meeting on this issue, trying to reach as many folks as possible. The planning board has discussed a lot of different areas in joint conversation with us, again, at public meetings. And so there's been a process over the past year. We're hoping that people have been able to hear about it and learn about it through one way or another. The key that's upcoming that we've kind of bolded at the bottom here is that now that we're at the run-up to town meeting, the planning board is going to open its public hearing process on the proposed zoning bylaw starting next week. And it's anticipated there's going to be a couple of public hearings on the bylaw itself through March. And so the public is more than welcome and is encouraged to come and participate in those public hearing efforts to give your feedback to the planning board on the proposed bylaw before it makes its way to the town meeting warrant. So just before we hop into the districts that we're looking at in town and some of the things that we've considered, we want to give you an idea of the process that we've gone through, again, in conjunction with the planning board and select board here, and how we arrived at where we are today. So when we started it, there's several factors that we thought about when trying to find the right area in town. These came from both state recommendations as a part of the regulations on where they would like to see these districts put, and it's a combination of zoning best practices of where it may make sense to put multifamily housing. So the things we wanted to highlight here, number one, acreage. Is there a good amount of acreage where we can put those 50 acres that we're talking about? Location proximate to transit access. Is there a bus route or something nearby that makes it easy for folks to access transportation options besides using a car? Are there expanded opportunities for walkability or pedestrian access? Is there a way to build out a site that can allow for pedestrian access? And then finally, access to commercial corridors. We want to make sure this is close enough to amenities so that folks maybe don't have to travel all the way across town when they're trying to access a commercial corridor. I'm going to hand it over to Jean and Andrew now to talk a little bit about some of the areas we considered before getting to the areas that are being decided on today.
Thanks, Ian. And yeah, just like Ian said, and just to remind everybody, I'm an assistant town manager. I'm director of community and economic development. I've been working closely with Jean and with MVPC on the process to determine how we're going to comply with this zoning mandate. And I thought it'd be a good idea to just go through some of the areas that we considered when we were developing our ideas around where we were going to locate our compliant districts. And so I'll run through these relatively quickly. Of course, people can ask questions. I can pause at any time, and I'll jump right into it. So obviously here you see Royal Crest. I know this is a name and a title that a lot of people, it may trigger some people, some memories from a few years back when we had a pretty popular zoning proposal to redevelop the property a few years back. That would have called for a net of 676 new housing units, which was actually rejected. So although this is a good sized parcel, 75 acres, you know, and although it's located, you know, relatively well in terms of being on in a sort of a primary corridor, already connected to major utilities and so on and so forth, there are some sort of downsides to looking at this property, just given how contentious the redevelopment proposal was a few years ago, the fact that it's a little further away from 495 from other districts that we were looking at, and because it's not directly served by NEVA. And if you looked at a few slides earlier, you would have seen that one of the parameters or one of the criteria that we're looking at in terms of trying to get the best possible area for these zones, for these districts, is having it served by public transit. You can move to the next slide, Ian. So we also looked at the Eagle Tribune. It's 11 acres, which is smaller than a lot of some of the parcels that we were looking at. And so we would have been challenged in terms of having, if we chose this site, for instance, we would have had to probably look at least 2 other potential parcels. You know, it would have been hard to cobble together, you know, additional districts to create, to fold this in. And as you can see, there's a lot of single family homes directly surrounding it. And so we want to consider the issues around abutters as well. We know that, you know, having a whole new development come in, as was, you know, discussed during the whole Royal Crest discussion as well, it can be trying, it can be difficult. And we want to make sure that we're minimally disruptive if any developments come to fruition. You can move to the next slide, Ian. And we also looked at downtown. You know, this is something that I thought was intriguing as a planner, you know, because obviously there's been a lot of discussions about how do we continue to revitalize the downtown. I think one of the ways you do that is you bring more foot traffic to downtown, you bring more of a 24/7 market to downtown, meaning people who are there that can frequent businesses, and that could have definitely served as a revitalization trigger. But there's complexity there. You know, there's a lot of smaller parcels that we've had to cobble together. Which ones do you keep? Which ones do you let go of? And, you know, we discussed this a bit with the planning board, and I think the planning board really favored more of a tailored sort of organic approach to zoning in the downtown. As was referenced earlier in an earlier slide, there's a project on Main Street at the Santander Bank parcel that was recently passed by the planning board. And so there have been projects that have come forward, the Brad Street redevelopment being another one, that have come forward to the planning board, where the planning board was able to work very closely with the developer on trying to get it right as far as a redevelopment proposal. And so, you know, throwing in a new, you know, as of right multifamily housing district might upset that apple cart a little bit down here. So we decided to veer away from this, from the downtown area. Go to the next one, Ian. And then right by the downtown, of course, we have the East and West Mills, and as well as Princeton, North Andover. We combined these two areas. In terms of the mills, you'd have had 36 acres to work with. It's probably the least accessible site in terms of access to 495. It's not too far, of course. You can go down Sutton Street and get to it, or you can hook around to Main Street and go, you know, get to it eventually through Water Street. But you know, again, you have challenges here in terms of, you know, there's a just extremely dense surrounding area, a lot of abutters. You know, we've already seen a fair bit of development here with the Avalon projects that were recently developed. You have a lot of existing multifamily units in the mill buildings operated by RCG. So, you know, we just felt like this wasn't the ideal place to situate the compliant area of the district either. And then, of course, Princeton Properties, approximately 14 acres. Also, you know, 14 acres is not a huge chunk out of the 50 acres that we need to comply with the district requirement. It's not served by MIVA Transit. It's already built out. And it's not really a gateway improvement opportunity. That's something I've mentioned on a few of these other areas that we considered. So one thing we thought about, or at least thought was a benefit to the districts that we'll talk about in a few minutes, is that they are gateway improvement opportunities, meaning they're opportunities to, if redevelopment is to occur, it could maybe beautify and make it a little more enjoyable for someone coming into North Andover from the areas that the districts areas that we chose, where they're located. It can make it a little more enjoyable to come into North Andover, a little more visually appealing. And again, it's not as accessible to 495 as some of the other sites that we that we chose. And I see Stan Novak said it is very easy to add a bus stop. Stan, it is not easy to add a bus stop. I can assure you of that, my friend. I'm only mentioning that because I am the town's representative to MIVA, to their advisory board, and we are fighting hard to bring service up Route 125. Currently, it stops at Osgood Landing, but it doesn't go further than that. We wanted to loop all the way through 125, hooking a right on Sutton Street, going all the way to Lawrence to carry people to the MBTA station. And we're having to apply for a major grant to the state to approve funding to enable that bus route to happen. So I can appreciate that it sounds easy to add a bus stop, but it takes a lot of coordination. It takes a lot of effort. It actually takes funding as well in terms of paying bus drivers to operate those routes, having buses in service along those routes. So there's a lot that goes into it. And if it were the easy, I would want it to happen, of course. But we have to be thoughtful because the transit agency is you know, it's doing everything it can. I think that's all I had. I don't know if anybody had any questions about the districts we consider before we jump into the districts we're actually proposing. All right, hearing none, we can move forward. I think this is back to you, Ian, right?
Yeah, I can hop in here. So just to give you an idea of the process that we're going through. So once we decide on some potential options for where this fits in terms of the land area, the state has provided us with a tool. It's basically a giant Excel spreadsheet where we plug in all of the parcel data and lot data, and then plug in the zoning parameters that we're considering, things like minimum lot size, setback, parking ratios, that sort of thing. We plug those numbers into the spreadsheet, and it helps us figure out if it would be theoretically possible to create that many units that we're required to under the zoning parameters that we're outlining. So again, it's looking at basically if you have perfect conditions, if you already have the perfect infrastructure serving the site, if you have a perfect environmental site, everything works out in your favor. Would the zoning allow for this many units? And so that's what we have to check the box and say, yes, it does, or no, it doesn't, and reevaluate what the inputs are going to be, and therefore the zoning parameters that we're considering in terms of the tool and looking at compliance. And next. So now we're looking at some of the proposed districts in town. Andrew or Jean, do you want to talk about any of this, or do you want me to hop in?
Sure, no, I'll pick it up. All right, so as we said, we're going to move into the districts that we're proposing in the draft zoning bylaw that is being considered next week at the planning board. And so the first of which is 350 Winthrop Ave, known as the North Andover Mall. That outline there, it actually comprises 4 independent lots. So they're grouped together to form the district itself. 1600 Osgood Street is known as Osgood Landing. Again, it's shown in pink there. That's one continuous parcel that runs along the frontage of Osgood Street itself. And recently, Amazon distribution facility has been constructed to the rear of that parcel. So with both of these districts, as Ian said, we've plugged and played along with this model, and both using these 2 districts, we can reach compliance with an overlay district. Ian, if you can move ahead. So the North Andover Mall, some of the features of this land area is that it's 35-acre district. It's along Route 114 with easy access to Route 495. It is close proximity to commercial businesses along Route 114, both in North Andover and in our abutting Lawrence. It's served by MIVA bus routes. And the important thing here is these bus routes connect Lawrence, North Andover, and Andover. So it's definitely a way of getting pedestrians to this site. And as Andrew spoke about, we think it offers a really good gateway improvement opportunity to really strengthen the visual impact as you come into North Andover. And it aligns with the master plan strategies. So for Osgood Landing, this site is actually a 58-acre district, and again, along Route 125. It was originally envisioned as an area that could accommodate a new housing under a 40R bylaw. So 40R is another type of zoning overlay district which exists on the site. And it was envisioned that the site with Amazon at the time, Amazon's parcel at the time, would be a mixed use type development to include commercial uses along with housing, multifamily housing. It too is close to Route 495 via Ward Hill. It's close to commercial businesses along Route 125 and employers along Route 125. Again, opportunity for gateway improvement. Its potential for expanded MIVA bus route and the MBTA commuter rail access. And that's what Andrew just spoke about. So Amazon itself has constructed a bus layover area to the, looking at the building to the left of their constructed building. And so MIVA comes both along Osgood Street and now circles in, well, once they open in the short future here, the bus will circle into the parking lot and head back north in Haverhill. What we envision is continuing to work to strive towards getting that commuter bus to actually travel along Route 125 and ultimately to the station in Lawrence. And again, it aligns with the master plan strategies. And so when we look at district parameters, and this is what the zoning bylaw does, it kind of sets the requirements for the build out of a lot. But again, it's just a bylaw at this point, and that is all that we are required to do is be compliant with bylaw requirements. And so what we're proposing currently, and like I said, this is just starting the planning board. Well, the planning board has reviewed a draft bylaw a few times at meetings in the fall, but the public hearing process for that review starts on Tuesday night, February 20th. And so as proposed currently, the maximum building height would be 4 stories or 55 feet. At Osgood Landing. In the North Andover Mall, the 4th story could be allowed if the development contains a commercial use on the 1st floor or a parking garage. Otherwise, the North Andover Mall would be set at a 3-story or 35 feet maximum. The max building lot coverage, again, is proposed at 30%. The open space required is 30% of the total lot size. The minimum parking spaces per unit is proposed at 1.75, and the maximum units per acre is 15, right at the state requirement. And when Ian talked about the model, these are the parameters we're putting into that model in order to get that projection to see if we meet that 15 unit requirement as well as the 1,191 unit capacity. And then also in a zoning bylaw, we talk about dimensional criteria, which we just reviewed, but we also talk about permitted uses. So what could happen on these sites? And currently, the sites have different underlying zoning districts. So the Osgood Landing underlying zoning is an industrial 2 zoning district, and the North Andover Mall is a business 3 underlining zoning district. Those zoning districts remain in place. Anything that could happen on those parcels today would be allowed in the future. What we're proposing is called an overlay district. So it actually just overlay over that underlying, and the underlying remains in place. There's also an existing overlay zoning district at Osgood Landing. That's what we refer to as that 40R in our bylaw. It's called the Osgood. And that overlay district also remains in place. So the permitted uses proposed in the MBTA multifamily overlay district include, and we just took a little snapshot here. So it includes these, but certainly not limited to these. And the point of this slide is really to show a comparison of what we're proposing and what could be done there currently. And so art galleries are proposed uses in this new overlay. They're already allowed in both I2 and B3. We're introducing a new use of brewery, distillery, and/or winery. That's just not in our bylaw today. We think it's a good use for other areas in town, and in the future, we'll look to add that use in other zoning districts. But for now, we're introducing it to the bylaw. And then business and other offices are proposed. They are allowed already in I2 and B3. Eating and drinking establishments are allowed in B3 and the Osgood. Indoor places of amusement and ice skating are allowed in B3 and the Osgood. Multifamily dwellings and apartments. Now, this is really the crux of the new bylaw, right? It's to allow those by right. In the new overlay, they are allowed in the Osgood. And again, that's we refer to as the 40R. Research and development are currently allowed in B3, I2, and Osgood, and the retail establishments are allowed in B3 and Osgood. And so what we're proposing and what we hope for is a mixed-use development that includes multifamily housing, but the commercial uses are important too.
Yeah, and I'll add, Gene, one of the things that I like about this slide is it makes it very easy to point out that difference between construction versus zoning. And so just like how, for example, the permitted uses here include an art gallery, brewery, or retail establishment, just because the zoning exists doesn't mean we're going to see an art gallery built or a brewery built. And that same goes for the multifamily housing. We are allowing multifamily housing, but that doesn't mean it's going to be built just like all those other uses are allowed. So it's very similar to all the other zoning districts where you allow certain things, but it doesn't mean everything's actually going to happen. That's that difference here with this law where we're only talking about zoning and not construction.
Before we get into questions and feedback, Ian, I'll just add a little more to that, just to allay any thoughts or concerns. Obviously we can't guarantee if we were to pass this bylaw, and now the areas are compliant for multifamily housing. It's not really necessarily. We don't see anything happening imminently. I mean, Market Basket, and this has been widely publicized. They're going through a process right now where they're investing a lot of money to move from the location within the North Andover Mall Plaza to the Kohl's spot, and to have Kohl's move into what will become their former spot. And they're also going to be renovating the plaza, doing a lot of work to the grounds, to the landscaping and the parking area. And so that is all just to say they're investing a lot of money in that project. And they're aware that that we're proposing this, and they haven't really expressed much interest in developing housing on their property. Not to say it wouldn't happen in the future, but it's just it just doesn't seem like it's likely to happen anytime soon. It's just another tool in their toolbox if they decide they want to utilize it. And we don't know what's going to happen with Osgood Landing. Currently, there's a pretty sizable commercial office building there, and they may decide they want to just keep it as such, and find suitable tenants to occupy that building. So again, there's no requirement on our part. There's no requirement on anybody's part, on the owner's part, to have housing built on these properties. They can continue to utilize them as they're utilizing them.
Great points, Andrew. Thanks for bringing that up. We'll pause here and see if folks have any questions or feedback or want some clarification on what exactly is being proposed in town at this time.
I do have a question. When we looked at Eagle Tribune building, I know it's too small for the whole numbers that need to be reached, but what I like about North Andover is it doesn't look too modern. And that's a sovereign building that's planned. It seems to have been approved. That kind of terrifies me a little. And I'm definitely on the side of let's build more because I want our kids to be able to live in town. So I'm not against new construction and new developments as a principle. But what I would hope, the example you had with Marblehead Street, we live diagonally across from that house, and we've looked at a pretty dilapidated building for 15 years before it was redone. But I think they did a really good job in a neighborhood. It still looks kind of nice. And my hopes would be that maybe we could keep that in mind with the planning that is happening. It's not really a question, it's more my hopes, I guess.
No, I appreciate that feedback. I'll just respond in saying, and I agree with you. I think I think anytime you see new development happening, you want to make sure, and this is, part of the work that Jean does so well with the planning board, they want to ensure that whatever development's being proposed is in congruence with the surroundings. They don't want to just pop something out that looks like an eyesore. And that's a subjective thing. Some people are going to think certain buildings look great. Other people are going to think this doesn't fit at all. And, you can have that argument all day long. I think in the case of Eagle Tribune, I'm not certain that just because it's a smaller parcel, you would necessarily get developments that would resemble what you saw in Marblehead Street, at that level.
Yeah, I mean, it's a different area, but as a matter of principle, I thought, and if there's concern that the neighbors would be too much impacted, then just have a little bit land between the neighbors and the big industrial looking spot, and just maybe zone it for 300 units, and then we find other parcels, and in total we come up to the 1,200 that we need. I don't know. I just thought, at least I want to bring that up.
Yep. No, I appreciate the feedback, and I'll just say you're cluing in on our conundrum all the time, right? Like we have to make these decisions. We've got a lot of, we went through some of the parcels, including the Eagle Tribune site, and we just ultimately had to come up with, based on the timeline that we're up against to comply, which is by the end of this year. And it seems like, because we're only in February, that seems like a long time, but in reality, it's really not. And so we're just, we try to give everybody a little bit of a view into some of our thinking on this. And there's probably other areas of town that we're not talking about that could have very well been areas we could have considered. But again, I think between Osgood Landing and Market Basket being on major corridors, accessible to transit, Osgood Landing having already been considered a site for housing in the past, and being in disparate areas of town, kind of spreading out that the impact, if you will, and also providing good access for people so that people don't necessarily have to travel through town to get to those sites. They can get on 495, go to work, come home, get to their apartment if that's where it's built. Those are things that we took into consideration and put a heavy emphasis on, and that's where we landed. So
thank you.
Appreciate the feedback. I do.
Something to keep in mind too, and Andrew and Jean can correct me if I misspeak, but the town is also working through a process separately of looking at rezoning downtown in that area. And I think part of that process is trying to encourage exactly what you saw on Marblehead Street nearby you. And so we didn't go with downtown for this option because we wanted the downtown zoning to play out in its way to encourage the exact type of development that you've seen directly across from you. And this MBTA zoning didn't quite fit for it. So I think you stay engaged in that process as the town works through that to hopefully encourage more of those small, nice looking developments within a neighborhood.
And just on that, just to clarify, so we did sort of table or shelve that process or that project to rezone downtown for the precise reason of concentrating on this effort for MBTA compliance. So that kind of, the MBTA communities law kind of came and smacked us in the back of the head while we were in the process of looking at the downtown area. And so we thought to ourselves, let's not throw everything on the table at one town meeting. Let's concentrate on compliance and getting people's buy-in on this and how we're going to approach MBTA communities. And then we can revisit rezoning downtown if that's something people want to do. But I agree with Ian, that's an opportunity for you all, for the public at large, to stay engaged and to have an input on how do we want our downtown to look in the future? How do we want to revitalize it? And how are we going to get to that point? And is housing a part of that?
And we could spend another hour talking about that right now. Other questions or thoughts or feedback? Kathleen?
Hi, Kathleen Caldwell, 253 Hickory Hill Road. Thank you to Ian, Andrew, and Jean for great presentations. Really helpful for me to see what our community is doing and your thought process to date. I appreciate that, and I think you've chosen some good logical locations. I did have a question about an affordability component. I think oftentimes that's a big question about this MBTA communities in general and how each community is going to address that. So I just thought it would be helpful for you to address that question. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm happy to speak to the technicalities there, Andrew, or Jean, if that works. So as you may know, the town currently has an inclusionary zoning bylaw, which requires any new development over a certain threshold to have 15% of the units in that development be affordable. This state law, as it stands today, it allows affordability at that level if the town can prove that it is economically feasible for a developer to build that many affordable units as a part of a development. It's a bit of a weird technical piece, but essentially MVPC is working with the town to produce what's called an economic feasibility analysis to prove to the state that that 15% affordability requirement is feasible for a development to build. If that proves out to be feasible, then that 15% affordability requirement will apply to these zoning districts. If we come into a situation where we figure out that for some reason or another, maybe because of high construction costs right now, it is not feasible, then we are allowed to do a maximum of 10% affordability in these districts, and the town will be defaulting to that 10% if we have to in those areas. So I think the bottom line is we are planning to hold at least some affordability in these districts. It just depends on what the state will allow us to do.
And I'll just quickly add, like, you know, when the state came out with its regulations on this, we could have easily just said, oh, we don't want to go through the process of having an economic feasibility analysis to justify the 15% affordability requirement that's laid out in our inclusionary zoning bylaw. But we decided we wanted to go through this process because we took a lot of time and effort, and Jean spent a lot of time herself. I want to acknowledge her efforts on this over the past couple of years to get that zoning bylaw passed, and we want to honor that because that's something that the people voted on the town meeting. So we don't want to exclude these areas where they could theoretically build more housing units from that bylaw. Now, of course, as Ian said, if the feasibility can't be proven, then we'll have to, double back and maybe go to the 10% threshold or do something else. But if we can do it, we want to do it. And I'll also just add, without getting too far into the weeds, I think most people on this call, if you're here, you're probably somewhat educated on housing. There is another state law called 40B, which requires every city and town in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts to have at least 10% of its housing stock designated as affordable. And we're currently under that threshold. And what that means is that a developer can come in and propose a development that doesn't require as stringent of a process. And they can do that as long as they're providing a certain number of those units as affordable. And so if we can get above that threshold, that 10% threshold, we'll be doing two things. We'll be in better shape because we're providing more affordable housing units, so it's the right thing to do. But we'll also be less susceptible for those other types of 40B projects in the future. So we're hoping that the inclusionary zoning bylaw can help us get closer to that 10% threshold.
I have one in the weeds question for you guys. Did our 40R district have an affordability component?
Jean might have more specifics, but it did.
Well, that's
and
fine.
I want to say it's higher than what our inclusionary zoning bylaw calls for.
Yes, I agree with that.
Okay, great. Thank you. Appreciate it.
Any other questions from folks? All right. Well, hearing none, a reminder, I'll pan to the end here where we just talk about kind of what's going on in the future. We're going to continue to get community input and feedback. A reminder that the planning board public hearings start next week. And so that is your opportunity to comment to the planning board, your opinions on the bylaw. Then eventually, after it works through its public hearing process, it will be up for a vote at the annual town meeting this coming May. And the town has until the end of the year to be in compliance. So if it fails at town meeting this May, then we'll have to look at other options for getting a bylaw passed by the end of the calendar year at another town meeting. More information, you can go on the town's website. If you navigate to the planning page of the northandovermass.gov, on the left side, there is a menu option where you can click on MBTA communities and you can read a ton of information about what's happened in the past and what's currently happening in the future. This meeting here, because it was recorded, we'll be posting it on the website in the coming days. So if you want to go back and refresh your memory on any of this, you can feel free to go online on that webpage and check out the meeting to review the slides once again. Anything from the town here?
I was just going to add, Ian, thank you. Just on the webpage, please do refer back to it because we will post this meeting recording. If you want to go back and look at anything that we discussed tonight, we'll post this slide deck, and we'll be updating some FAQs. You know, there's really not a great built out FAQ list on that page, but we'll be developing that further and trying to provide a little more robust information in the run up to town meeting so people can get some information. And I suspect we'll also be doing a little more public education on this, even beyond the public hearing process that we'll be going through with the planning board, like what the town has done in the past with town meeting articles, where sometimes we'll get information up on NACAM or things like that. So just look out for more information. And Gina and I are very accessible. If anyone has questions in the future, to email us or call the office, we can certainly be available too.
Thanks, Andrew. Thank you all for attending tonight. I'm going to end the recording. Thank you and enjoy the rest of your Thursday. And hopefully we see you at town meeting come May.